Hello, this is a video all about the studio, the real breakout show of 2025 so far. I wanted to talk about this show but didn't necessarily know how, and thought instead of doing a review, I would just rank all the episodes, and while I was ranking them, get to the root of what makes this show great, what makes this show not so great, and hopefully get to talk about some of the cameos, which is kind of the major draw of this show to an extent, as well as its satirical view of Hollywood. Ranking all the episodes is also quite apt for a show that I think is bringing back an episodic nature to television that has been missing in the streaming era. You could really go into any given episode of the studio and be able to understand what's going on and also be endlessly entertained by it. They all stand alone, but they also find a way to build itself up into a really great season finale with this two-parter that I'll get to much later in the ranking. So many shows lately have just started to feel like longer movies, and as a result, it's quite refreshing to watch the studio actually be what a show should be. It's not perfect, and I'll get into some of my complaints about it as I get into each episode. So why don't I just get into it, starting with number 10, what I think is the weakest studio episode of season 1. And that is episode 5, The War, a episode that primarily centers around Ike Barinholtz and Chase Sue Wonder's characters as they kind of struggle for power within the studio. I think this episode is quite okay. If this is your worst episode in a season, then you're definitely doing something right. And these two supporting characters in particular are some of my favorite in the show, mainly because Barinholtz and Wonders are so great. And when they're on screen together in this episode, it is quite fun. They're both really nailing the comedic timing and like the comedic intensity of their rivalry. But I do find the plot around them to be relatively uninteresting in this episode, partly because I've never seen Smile and I don't really know who Owen Klein is. So as a result, a lot of the cameos are not super significant to me, and I think they do a pretty okay job. Owen Klein in particular is pretty funny, but I don't know if this episode really does too much to elevate itself above the rest of the show. And it does kind of stick out like a sore thumb as these two characters get a sense of an arc within this episode, but are also never really anything more than static background characters for the rest of the season. So while it is a kind of fun diversion to be focusing on two very different characters in this episode, it's not necessarily doing anything that pushes the season forwards or anything that is necessarily all that entertaining. At number 9, we actually have the episode right after that, episode 6, The Pediatric Oncologist, which centers around Matt as he is dating this doctor. And then they go to some gala, and really the main joke of this episode is that Matt is continually trying to get people to believe that making movies is just as important as saving lives as a doctor. And they get a lot of really great laughs out of this. Seth Rogen is really great at this type of cringe comedy, but it is kind of nailing the exact same joke over and over again, and as a result gets a little bit repetitive. It's also an example of Matt being just such a deeply unlikable character. He's quite frustrating in a lot of moments in this show, and usually I don't mind if a protagonist is unlikable, but it is somewhat frustrating in this episode. I do find a lot of the jokes to be really great, specifically when Matt bets on the golf auction that all of the doctors want just to kind of be an asshole. And the Johnny Knoxville, Josh Hutcherson diarrhea zombie movie directed by Spike Jonze is one of the funnier fake movies within the studio. Ultimately, the stagnant nature of the comedy of this episode does drag it down just a little bit. At number 8, we have episode 3, The Note, which is the one that centers around Ron Howard's new fake movie, which is apparently quite good until it ends up being very bad when it goes into this diatribe in the third act that the studio executives and really everyone but Ron Howard is desperate to cut. But people are too scared to stand up to Ron Howard and tell him that the sequence sucks. Another example of a joke being repeated, there's 5 or 6 different scenes where someone's just about to tell Ron Howard that the sequence sucks, and then they're like, oh, actually it's great. And that's kind of the joke, is that tension being alleviated. And some of the scenes work better than others. I really like the one where Ike Barinholtz does it. I just think Ike Barinholtz is really, really funny in this show. Anthony Mackie is also delivering a very funny cameo within this episode. I also really like what Ron Howard is doing here as an actor. A lot of the time the studio is giving these directors or these actors or just these celebrities or people in Hollywood the opportunity to play against type or play against their typical persona. So Ron Howard, who is typically seen as this likable and wholesome guy, getting to just cuss out Seth Rogen is pretty funny to watch. And that scene alone makes some of the somewhat repetitive comedy of this episode worth it. I will say that the Alphabet City movie, the fake movie that Ron Howard is directing in this episode, is one of the worst looking fake movies in this show. That's not really that huge of a reason why it's low on this list. I just wanted to point out that it just looks like Collateral, except instead of Michael Mann, it's Ron Howard directing it, and instead of Jamie Foxx, it's Anthony Mackie, and instead of Dave Franco, it's Tom Cruise, which are like major downgrades in all three departments. But that's mainly a side note. I think this episode is pretty good, pretty passable, but again, kind of like Pediatric Oncologist, does have some repetitive jokes that tend to stagnate quite a bit, specifically in the middle section of the episode. At number 7, we have episode 7, Casting, which centers around them trying to cast the Kool-Aid movie. And it's a pretty funny and satirical and insightful look into how casting works within Hollywood. I'm not necessarily sure if this is exactly how it works, but it does have that sense of like, we want to be diverse and inclusive, but also not offensive to anyone. And the way that those two conflicting desires can lead into a lot of like pedantic and quite ridiculous conversations within Hollywood. My favorite moment is the Lil Ray Howery cameo, where he talks about how the Kool-Aid man has the essence of a black man, which he delivers with so much sincerity that it's just incredibly funny to me. I do think the central conceit of this episode is really, really good. My main complaint is the way that it ends, where the primary joke of this final scene is that they were worried about people being upset about the casting, but really people are worried about that they're using AI in the movie, which is supposed to be like this subversive final gag, but ends up coming off quite predictable because they bring this up early in the episode, and it's kind of like a Chekhov's gun moment where like clearly that's going to come into play later. So when it ends up happening at the convention, it's like, well, yeah, obviously that was going to happen, and it ends up coming off as quite disappointing and anticlimactic. But for the most part, Casting is a great example of the studio actually being quite insightful on how Hollywood works, and on top of it has a pretty good Ice Cube cameo as well. At number 6, we have episode 2, The Oneer, which is where we really get into one of my major complaints of this show, which is the somewhat desperate attempt to feel like a cinephile on Seth Rogen's part. It's difficult to know whether or not this is his character, Matt, who is constantly trying to impress creatives, or if it's Seth Rogen, who for the majority of his career has been seen as like this goofy pot-smoking comedian who is trying to now shed that persona and become something more serious. And in that attempt is trying something that is quite a bit more prestigious than the majority of things that he's made, but is also trying to almost like flaunt his cinema knowledge in a somewhat obnoxious way. The best example of this is whenever he starts to talk about all of the great one takes within this episode, the one takes in cinema history that he loves. That just feels like someone naming movies at you. That is a little bit obnoxious to me, but this is only like a small moment in the episode, and it's a little bit of a nitpick. The other criticism I have is the derivative nature of this style. This show feels quite a bit like Birdman, as well as The Player by Robert Altman, which is honestly one of the best movies ever, and this is a great example of it. This episode, episode 2, centers around a fictional Sarah Polley movie where they're trying to get this one long take right before the sun sets, and Matt keeps messing it up. And they're being kind of meta by having this entire episode take place in just one take, which, by the way, this entire show has a lot of long takes within it. And sometimes they are being used just for the sake of being used, in my opinion, almost just trying to be flashy and impressive for the sake of it. But sometimes it really is used for a purpose, and I think for the most part it's used well within this episode. But this is also an idea that literally happens within the player. The movie opens with a long take where studio executives are talking about other long takes within movies, which is literally what happens within this episode. And it's difficult to tell whether this is a homage or whether this is just like a blatant ripoff of what happens in the player. But whatever the case, I do find it to be somewhat frustrating. Other than that, I think this episode is pretty solid. It is truly quite impressive that they're able to do all this in one take, and I'm pretty sure that they're actually doing it in one take. Like, there's no hidden cuts within this, which is like a staggering, impressive feat of television. Sarah Polley really nails the being annoyed at Seth Rogen thing that she has to do within this episode, and I just think it starts and ends really, really well. I like how they kind of have this great bookend to it. The way they start with the car and end with the car is quite clever. I also think that the score is really helping to build up the tension of this episode. And while I do have some nitpicks about it, I do think that it is one of the more entertaining episodes of the studio. At number 5, we have The Presentation, which is the season finale, episode 10, and it centers around Matt and the rest of the crew trying to deliver a CinemaCon presentation while all being incredibly high. It's basically all of the huge cameos within this season all coming together into one presentation. And I think it works for the most part, although my main criticism of this episode is that there's a suspension of disbelief that like people in the crowd of CinemaCon would actually like believe that this is going well. There's a lot of movies and shows that do this where people are trying to hold it together for a public presentation, and there's like this tightrope you have to walk as the writers where you have to make it feel like they are believably coming off as competent, but are also like very close to teetering on the edge of coming off as incompetent. And I'm not sure that this episode does that too well. There are moments where it's pretty obvious, like if this actually happened in a CinemaCon presentation, it would be like a main headline that like this studio head is probably either dying or really, really high. And so there is some suspension of disbelief to be had within this episode. But I think once you kind of let go of that, it is a really fun conclusion to this season. Getting to see all of the major cameos and all of the major fictional movies all come together into one presentation is quite fun. And while I do think the final moment where they all just start chanting about movies is a little bit corny, it is a great example of what this show really is about. It's about like the magic of filmmaking, and is ending off this season in a charming way, but also in a somewhat ambiguous way where you could really go either way on if things start to go bad or good for the studio in the next season. We also get a return of the Dave Franco cameo that is within episode 9 that I will get to later. That is probably the best cameo in the entire show. So ultimately, I think this is a strong conclusion to the season. At number 4, we have episode 4, The Missing Reel, which centers around a fake Olivia Wilde movie starring Zac Efron, where a reel has gone missing, and as a result, they are not going to be able to complete the film until someone finds that reel. Zac Efron is my favorite cameo here. He does a really great job of acting pissed off at Seth Rogen, which is really a clear trademark and hallmark of what makes a great studio cameo, because most of the time, the people, the celebrities within this show just have to act pissed off and frustrated with Rogen, and Efron plays upset quite well in this episode. I also think this is one of the more fun homages within the studio, as this is somewhat spoofing Chinatown or just noirs in general. I also think gets to the root of what makes Matt such a compelling character in this season, which is someone who wants so desperately to be liked, but is also so neurotic and so desperate to have approval that he ends up just coming off as a little annoying. This episode gives the audience chances to sympathize with both Matt as well as the people that have to put up with his somewhat uptight attitude. I also think the final long take of the whole Olivia Wilde, Seth Rogen confrontation is really, really funny and culminates in a great Chinatown reference that I think is one of the most clever in the entire show. So ultimately, maybe not one of the most memorable episodes of the studio, but is definitely one of my personal favorites. At number 3, we have episode 1, The Promotion. which has probably the most memorable cameo of this entire season, Martin Scorsese. The whole Kool-Aid movie thing is a really brilliant idea. I personally really love Steve Buscemi in this episode. He only has one scene, but he absolutely kills it. My main criticism of this episode is the way that it handles the discussion of what Hollywood should be. A lot of the show is about how Hollywood has become very IP fueled and very derivative. And as a result, we should kind of push into more original stories and get a lot of great directors to make great films. But the point that I think this episode, as well as the show in general, is trying to make is that to some extent that's not really going to happen. You need a bit of a balance between the IP stuff and the more original films. But the way they go about delivering this narratively, I think, is incredibly frustrating and comes off more like Matt is just bad at his job than that this is quite impossible to do. Like, you could have a Martin Scorsese Jonestown movie and a Kool-Aid movie at the same time. I think you could pull it off if you just knew how to do your job right. Another thing that makes Matt quite frustrating as a character. But that aside, I think this is a great episode. The whole Kool-Aid idea is absolutely genius, and Scorsese is honestly really great at acting in this episode. Unlike a lot of cameos here, he's not necessarily playing against his persona. He's basically just being Martin Scorsese, but he's being Martin Scorsese really well and in a really ridiculous scenario. And as a pilot or as a premiere, I think this episode does a really great job of setting up Matt as a character, setting up the style of the show, and setting up what it's going to be about. So simultaneously, a really effective opener while also delivering some of the more memorable moments in the entire show. At number 2, we have the Golden Globes, episode 8, which is about Matt trying to get Zoe Kravitz to congratulate him in her acceptance speech. Has one of my favorite gags of the entire show, which is the Adam Scott acceptance speech, where he thanks Sal Saperstein and then everyone else starts to do it. And the thing that really sells it is Ike Barinholtz as Sal, every single time being like endlessly overjoyed that people are saying his name, and then immediately panning over to Seth Rogen, who just looks incredibly pissed off that everybody is naming Sal and not him. And Adam Scott, I think, is the best cameo here. He's the first one that does it, and I just really like his acceptance speech. I think it's quite funny. You also have a small Zack Snyder cameo where he makes a joke at his own expense that I thought was pretty funny. And overall, this episode is kind of about like the performative nature of these award shows. Now, people want to act like they don't want the recognition, but really all that is just an act, and they really aren't as humble as they let on. I don't necessarily know if this is true for all people in Hollywood, but I do think there is a grain of truth to what this episode is getting at. It's also making good use of the long take format of the show. I love panning from the tables to whoever is talking on stage. Rami Youssef is doing a great job of hosting these fictional Golden Globes. It actually made me kind of want him to host an Oscars or a Golden Globes at some point. But anyway, the long take format does a great job of covering the entirety of the award show, and also leads to a pretty great Seth Rogen driving away in a limo while being very contemplative about his life in the final scene. And these are the moments that kind of get me to sympathize with Matt as a character, even if he is quite unlikable in specific moments. It's his clear passion and excitement, as well as his clear loneliness and lack of fulfillment, that makes him a compelling character. And Rogen actually nails that really well. He's very funny in this show, but he also is just endlessly sympathetic. So ultimately, this is one of my favorite episodes because A, it has a lot of Ike Barinholtz being funny, which is one of my favorite parts of the studio. He's probably my favorite supporting character. B, it's at an award show, and I just kind of mess with award shows. And C, it is one of the better Seth Rogen performances of the entire season. But the Golden Globes is not my favorite episode of season 1. That honor goes to episode 9, CinemaCon. They all basically go to CinemaCon, and then there's a huge party, and Matt, because he wants people to like him, has a bunch of drugs, and then everyone gets way too high, and then everyone basically just starts tripping. The best example of why this long take works within the context of the studio, this is a very anxiety-ridden episode, and having a lack of cuts really amps up that tension and that anxiety. Also, a real commitment to acting high from everyone involved, most notably Zoe Kravitz and Dave Franco, who I mentioned before, but Dave Franco is hilarious. He's kind of doing something similar to what Michael Cera did in This Is the End, where he's playing a fictionalized version of himself that's just like a very obnoxious party animal. There is a world where this performance comes off as a little annoying because it is literally just Dave Franco yelling at people. But he is really committed and he really sells it in a way that makes it the best cameo of this entire season. I also really love what Bryan Cranston is doing here. He is just tripping the whole time and once again is doing great comedic work here. I think people forget how funny Bryan Cranston is because he was on Breaking Bad and was so dramatic for so long. But like Cranston is genuinely hilarious in this episode. And the whole final sequence where they have to go find his character is really, really funny and a really great way of using Vegas as a setting. That's another thing, is this setting is very visually fun to look at, and once again the one take style and just the really great visual flair of the cinematography of this show really lends itself well to that location. I think this episode, CinemaCon, is a great example of what makes the studio so great. Not only that visual style, but also the great Seth Rogen kind of dumb but funny humor, as well as the absurdly committed cameos within this show that really elevate it above anything else on television right now. I do have some criticisms that I mentioned when I was talking about some of the weaker episodes, which is some of that derivative nature as well as some of that desperation to be seen as a cinephile on Rogen's part. But for the most part, I think the show really starts to hit its stride later on, and the last 3 or 4 episodes really got me entirely sold on this show. I can't wait for season 2, partly because the studio has a lot of things that it could do. It has a lot more people that could have cameos. It has a lot more narratives that it can explore. It has a lot more insights that it can make on Hollywood and the way that it's run. There's really like an endless surplus of things that can happen here, and I hope it continues that episodic nature because I found having a new cameo and a new fake movie in every episode to be really entertaining. It did lead to a somewhat hit or miss season, but I think the writing is so strong and the performances are so great that for the most part, it's mainly hits. And yeah, that's really what I have to say about the studio. My favorite episode is CinemaCon. My least favorite episode is The War. And my favorite cameo of all of them is probably a two-way tie between Dave Franco and Martin Scorsese. A somewhat flawed show, but is nevertheless a really, really fun one. And I think a great example of what television should be shifting towards, maybe less towards the 4-hour movie stuff and more towards this episodic stuff. And yeah, that's all I got to say. One of the best things that Rogen has really ever done in his whole career. So if you haven't watched the studio, go watch it. This is kind of a weird time to come out with this video, I realize, because this show ended like a month or so ago. But I don't know. I just thought I'd do it now. I know the Emmy noms are going to come out in a few weeks, I'm pretty sure. So this show will definitely be on it. So yeah, anyway, go watch the studio. That's about it. Like this, subscribe if you want, if you made it this far. And that's all I got to say. Goodbye.